The history of the UFC isn't written by the winners. It is written by the accidents. One slipped disc, one tripped cable, or one incompetent judge can change the timeline of the entire world. Here are the 15 darkest paradoxes that broke the MMA timeline. Lee Murray is the greatest what if in history, not because of what he did in the cage, but what he did in the streets. This is a man who knocked out Tito Ortiz, the reigning UFC champion at the time, in a street fight, while wearing a tuxedo and dress shoes. He was a terrifying striker who took Anderson Silva to a decision. But Murray didn't want gold belts. He wanted gold bars. In 2006, instead of training for a title shot, he masterminded the Securitas Depot robbery, stealing 53 million pounds. Wait, he did what? It was the largest cash heist in British history. If Lee Murray wasn't a criminal genius, he likely becomes the first British champion a decade before Michael Bisping. Instead, the man who beat up the champ for free is currently rotting in a Moroccan prison cell. Evan Tanner was the champion who taught himself to fight by reading books, but his desire to conquer himself was fatal. He rode into the California desert to cleanse his soul. He ran out of water but refused to call for help, believing he could mentally overcome dehydration. Unfortunately, he never walked out. The same stubborn mindset that made him a world champion was exactly what killed him.
This is the darkest irony in the sport. War Machine was a UFC veteran who committed a horrific crime and went to prison for life. But his arrest created a miracle. Because he was pulled from an event, a replacement fighter stepped in. To clear the replacement, the commission demanded a brain scan. That scan found a fatal condition that would have killed him if he fought. War Machine destroyed lives, but his arrest accidentally saved one. In 2004, Frank Mir was the scariest heavyweight on earth. Then, a car knocked him off his motorcycle. He lost 2 years of his prime learning to walk again. If Frank Mir takes a taxi that day, the Brock Lesnar era never happens. The entire modern heavyweight history exists solely because Frank Mir decided to ride his bike. In 1995, Oleg Taktarov was choked unconscious. The referee didn't notice. Oleg stopped breathing. He was clinically dead. His cornerman jumped the fence and revived him. If he doesn't jump that fence, the UFC has a fatality on live TV in the 90s, and the sport is banned forever. In one of the most iconic moments in MMA history, Kevin Randleman executed a powerful suplex that landed Fedor Emelianenko on his head during their Pride 2004 fight. Randleman suplexed Fedor directly onto his brainstem. Physics says this breaks a human neck. Paralyzation should be immediate. But Fedor was a cyborg. He ignored the broken neck, reversed it, and won. If Fedor is human, Pride FC collapses that night. Anderson Silva's leg break was one of the most shocking and gruesome injuries in MMA history, occurring during his rematch with Chris Weidman at UFC 168 on December 28, 2013. Anderson Silva threw a leg kick. Chris Weidman checked it. Silva's shin snapped in half. But this is a game of millimeters. If Weidman checks that kick 1 inch lower, Silva hits muscle, not bone. The leg doesn't break. The Spider continues his reign. 1 inch destroyed a legacy. Vitor Belfort defeated Michael Bisping via TKO with a head kick and punches in the second round of UFC on FX7 on January 19, 2013. A TRT-fueled Vitor Belfort kicked Michael Bisping so hard it detached his retina. Bisping fought half his career legally blind in one eye. After the injury, he was forced to become a defensive mastermind because he literally couldn't see punches coming from his right side. Even with this handicap, he developed the tactical genius required to knock out Luke Rockhold and become a world champion at 37. Alistair Overeem in 2010 was a comic book villain. He was slated to fight Junior Dos Santos for the title, but he got too big. His pectoral muscle literally exploded from the tension of his own mass. The fight was cancelled. The Overeem era ended not by a punch but by his own body failing to contain his ego. Khabib versus Tony Ferguson is the most cursed matchup in the history of combat sports. It was booked 5 separate times over 5 years. It survived lung collapses, failed weight cuts, and global pandemics. It was the immovable object against the unstoppable force. Then, just 6 days before the biggest fight of the decade, the universe intervened. Tony Ferguson, a man who trains by kicking steel poles, tripped over a thin production cable while wearing sunglasses indoors. He tore his LCL off the bone just by saying hello to a friend. The paradox? If Tony looks down for 1 second, he fights Khabib in his prime. If he fights Khabib, he never takes the life-changing beating from Justin Gaethje that triggered his record-breaking losing streak. Because of one piece of plastic on a floor, the boogeyman era ended, and we were robbed of the most important fight in lightweight history. Jon Jones is the only fighter in history to lose to himself. On paper, he has one loss, a disqualification to Matt Hamill. But Jones wasn't losing. He was committing a sanctioned execution. He was using 12-6 elbows, a strike banned because 1990s politicians thought they were powerful enough to break bricks like in old karate movies. The fight was over, but the comedy of errors was just beginning. Referee Steve Mazzagatti reached the peak of absurdity when he looked at a bloodied, face-down Matt Hamill and asked him verbally if he could continue. The problem? Hamill has been deaf since birth. He literally couldn't hear the question that determined the end of the fight.
The paradox? If the ref stops the fight 10 seconds earlier for a TKO, or if the commission used common sense, Jon Jones is the undefeated king of the sport. Instead, the greatest legacy in mixed martial arts history is permanently stained by an ancient rule about breaking ice? Yeah. And a referee who tried to talk to a man who couldn't hear him. In 2018, the UFC did something that felt like a corporate fever dream. They traded the most technical fighter to ever live, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, to one championship in exchange for Ben Askren. It was the first player trade in MMA history, and it set off a nuclear chain reaction. Askren gets slammed by Robbie Lawler. Then Masvidal lands the 5-second flying knee. Wait, Masvidal becomes a superstar? Then Ben Askren gets knocked out by YouTuber Jake Paul. If this trade never happens, Ben Askren never fights Jorge Masvidal. Without that 5-second flying knee, Masvidal stays a respected journeyman instead of becoming the BMF global superstar. But the darkest twist? This trade eventually led to Ben Askren getting knocked out by Jake Paul, legitimizing the celebrity boxing era that has haunted the sport ever since. The UFC traded away their greatest technician and accidentally birthed the era of YouTube boxing. UFC 94, The Super Fight. GSP versus BJ Penn. BJ Penn was the prodigy, a jiu-jitsu wizard who could submit anyone. But during the fight, he couldn't hold GSP down. He claimed GSP felt like a greased seal. After the fight, footage showed GSP's cornerman rubbing GSP's back with the same hands he used to apply Vaseline to his face. This scandal, known as Greasegate, changed the sport forever. GSP insisted it was a breathing technique, not cheating, but the UFC didn't care. They created a new rule. Now, a neutral cut man applies the Vaseline, and a commission inspector must wipe the fighter down before they enter the cage. If GSP wasn't so slippery that night, we might still have corners applying their own grease, and BJ Penn might have been the first man to truly stop the GSP train. In early 2021, Petr Yan wasn't just the champion. He was the boogeyman. He had just dismantled the legendary Jose Aldo and was systematically erasing every contender in the deepest division in the sport. He was on a collision course with greatness, and the bantamweight GOAT title was his for the taking. UFC 259 was supposed to be a formality. Yan was winning. Sterling was broken, grounded, and waiting for the end. But then, the paradox of trust. Yan looked at his corner for a split second. They yelled, "Knee!" Yan, a disciplined machine, didn't question it. He threw an illegal power knee that changed the course of MMA history. If Yan doesn't listen to his corner, he finishes Sterling and likely holds that belt for years. We never get the Sean O'Malley upset or the Merab Dvalishvili era, because Yan, at his peak, was the kryptonite for all of them. Instead of a 5-6 title defense run and a GOAT legacy, he lost his crown, his momentum, and his status in a single second of blind obedience. The king didn't get conquered, he just followed a bad order. For years, Yan was the uncrowned king in a downward spiral, losing razor-thin decisions and watching the division move on. The paradox seemed complete. The best fighter in the world had been defeated by a rule book. But then, the timeline corrected itself. Against all odds, Yan fought his way back through the fire, eventually defeating the machine-like Merab Dvalishvili to reclaim his gold. The dynasty wasn't dead, it was just on a 4-year hiatus. The boogeyman is back, and the bantamweight GOAT conversation has officially been reopened. We end with the paradox of existence. In 2001, the UFC was a corpse. It was banned from major cable, hated by politicians, and bleeding money. The owners were so desperate they offered to sell the entire company to the Fertitta brothers for just $2 million. The Fertitta's lawyers told them they were insane. They said, "You aren't buying a sports league, you're buying a lawsuit and a bad reputation." If the Fertittas listen to their legal team, the UFC closes its doors in 2001. There is no Conor McGregor, no Ronda Rousey, and no Khabib. But they ignored the experts and took the gamble. In 2016, they sold that $2 million mistake for $4 billion. Every punch thrown, every leg snapped, and every legend born in the modern era exists only because two billionaires decided to ignore their lawyers and bet on a blood sport. One wrong step, one bad judge, or one $2 million check, and everything changes. Paradox. Resolved.